Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, so she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." Well, I got to tell you, I don't know how many of you are planning to have some summer time off, take some time away this summer. And, most people try to do that. But people have varying degrees to which they get away when they get away, all right? So some people really get away, and some people, they get away, but they're not really away. And there was a really funny Facebook meme that's gone around for a while that I've seen that it also relates to my personal experience, and it's this. It's comparing how Europeans and Americans leave the office, all right? And so it says, "European out of office. I'm away camping for the summer. Please email back in September." American out of office. "I have left the office for 2 hours to undergo kidney surgery, but you can reach me on my cell anytime." Okay? This is pretty much true. I mean, I remember back when I was doing business with European companies in the pharmaceutical industry. I remember one year we were working on a contract, and we said to the person, we're negotiating the contract terms back and forth, and he says, "You got to get the contract to me. If we're going to finish it, you got to finish it by Friday because I'm going on holiday." And my company, we were just like, "Okay, well, we'll fax it to your hotel." And he's like, "I'm going to be on holiday." And we're like, "That's why we're sending it to your hotel." And he's like, "No, I'm on holiday." and he's like, "You don't seem to understand what vacation is." And the Americans, we're like, "You don't seem to understand what being an executive is." All right, and so it would go. So we experienced this, and it was actually kind of funny. I have to admit, I am entirely the latter. In fact, I would probably be saying, if I lie down on the conference table, can you do the surgery in my office? Okay, so I don't actually have to leave. But, it is a matter of how we view these different priorities that we have in life. And this story today is talking about this balancing and dealing with the different pulls that we have. And you have the story where Jesus and his disciples have come to this home where it's referred to as Martha's house, and Mary is her sister. So the implication, of course, is that Martha is the older sister, the older sibling, because it's referred to as her house. And so they're there, and Mary is sitting at the Lord's feet and listening to what he's saying. Now, it's important to realize she's not just being lazy, okay? So she's not being lazy, she's presumably learning, all right? And so she's learning. She's listening to Jesus, and she's learning. Whereas Martha, wants Mary to be helping her with the task of hospitality, which is an absolute obligation in that society, okay? When you have guests, hospitality is the absolute obligation. And there's also a lot of subtext in here that you could get into, because there could be some sexism involved here in terms of Martha believing that Mary should be doing what would have been a woman's job in that time rather than sitting with the men and listening to Jesus. So there's all kinds of stereotype breaking that's happening in this story. But really, this issue is that Martha wants Mary to help her. And so Martha goes to Jesus and blames him for this disruption, basically, and says, "You need to be helping me." And so Martha is distracted by her tasks and goes to Jesus and says, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. She's listening to you. She's sitting at your feet listening to you, Jesus. Why are you letting her just sit there? You should be telling her, as long as she's listening to you, tell her that she needs to be helping me." Martha is basically saying, "Jesus, you're caring about her. You're teaching her, but you don't care about me. I'm the hostess. And you're not caring about the burden that's on me. Now, there are a couple words in this passage that are really important that I want to unpack for you, because there's always translation issues and things like this that come on up, and they're particularly important in this passage. And this word distracted that's used here, and we'll get into the fact that it appears twice in this passage, but it's not the same word. The word that appears here that's distracted is the word periaspato, which means to be pulled away from a reference point. Okay, so there's a reference point. There's something that you should be locked in on, something that you should be focused on, and then you get pulled away. Mary is at this reference point. She's at this reference point. She is sitting next to Jesus, okay, and she is listening to him. And so she's really at this reference point in her life, and she's being pulled, and Martha, on the other hand, is being pulled away. Martha's being pulled away from that reference point, and Jesus says to her, look, Martha, Martha, which, by the way, how many of you remember the Brady Bunch? I always think of this, whenever I hear this, I hear Marcia, Marcia in my head, all right? But, Martha, Martha, you're worried and distracted by many things. Now, one thing here to note is that Jesus never actually says that the serving is wrong. Right? So he doesn't actually say, hey, Martha, let go of the serving thing. Don't worry about the serving thing. All right? It's not important. Jesus never actually tells Martha to stop serving. He says, Martha, you're worried and distracted. Now, this second occurrence of the word distracted is not the same word in Greek that had just been translated as distracted before. It's not periaspato, okay? So one of the things when you're reading the scriptures is sometimes you need to consult different translations. If you're not familiar with the Greek or the Hebrew, consulting even different English translations in order to see how they handle a passage can be important, and then it can cause you to investigate. And a lot of the answers, a lot of the scholarly type answers that used to be available only to people who really had access to the materials is available through this thing called Google. And so if you were to just Google some of these questions about why the differences are there, you'll get a lot of these answers. You'll hone in on these commentaries, okay? And here, when Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're worried and distracted, if I show you two different translations, the one that we normally use is this one called the New Revised Standard Version. It's the standard translation used by mainline Protestants, okay? And then many of you probably remember, in fact, if you're older, when you were younger, the only English translation you would have used is the King James Bible, okay? So the King James Version, which goes back to the 16th century, okay? But the King James Version has been updated to modern English, and it's called the New King James Version, all right? And so if I compare the translation that we normally use as Presbyterians versus the New King James Version, you'll see the difference. The difference here is Jesus, in the version we use, says, you are worried and distracted by many things. And in the King James, the New King James, it says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things. And that word troubled is actually an accurate description of what that word actually is. It's about Martha's attitude. See, instead of being cheerful, instead of serving cheerfully, she's a wreck. All right? And if you've ever been, a guest in a home where the host is a wreck, no one's having a good time. Okay? So the hostess here, Martha, is a wreck. She's worried and she's troubled. Nobody's going to have fun. In fact, she's bothering Jesus with this problem that she's got with her sister. So basically at this point, right, no one's having fun here. Martha's not having fun. Mary's being complained about. Jesus is being interrupted, being told to get involved. Nobody is having a good time. All right? Instead of being the cheerful hostess, she's being a wreck, And it looks like, if you imagine the circumstance, she's extending this to everyone around her. Right? And so this attitude of being troubled is going to permeate the entire atmosphere. But notice what happens to her. And I love the phrasing that's in this verse. It said that she is distracted by her tasks, not from them. All right? She's not distracted from the tasks. She's got the list of tasks that she needs to do, all right? Instead, she's distracted not from the things she needs to do. She's distracted by the things she needs to do. And this is something that happens to me, and I think it happens to a lot of us. Ever had a day where you've got a long to-do list, and just reading the to-do list freaks you out? I mean, I've kind of had that. I've had that where I get up in the morning and go, oh my gosh, I'm panicking. I've got so many things I need to do today, and I'm absolutely panicking. Now, that panic is actually not helping one bit, all right? If you've got the things to do, and you've got that long to-do list, the way it should be is that it would help you bear down. You'd sit there and say, okay, I've got this long list of things to do, so I need to get on task number 1. And then when I finish it, I can get to task number 2. I've got this long list of things to do. The list should be helping to focus you. Instead, the list is actually keeping Martha from working. See, what's kind of interesting here is that Martha is complaining about Mary not helping. But the other person who's not working right now is Martha. She's not doing anything because she's complaining. All right? She's not actually working on her task. She's pulling Jesus away from teaching in order to complain to him about Mary. And one of the things that does happen in our lives, and I see it happen to myself, and I see it happen to a lot of people, is that we can get so anxious about work, we're not able to work effectively. The anxiety, the nervousness, the being worried, the being troubled, can actually keep us from working. You can get so worried about work that you stop working. Martha's anxiety is bringing everything to a halt in the house. It's being counterproductive at every level. And she's blaming her sister. See, she looks at what her sister has done and interprets it this way. Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me? Martha is choosing to see only the worst in how you interpret Mary's action. Now, what's a positive way she could have looked at this? She could have looked at what Mary was doing and said, wow, Mary's receiving teaching from Jesus. Wow, Mary is learning more about our Lord. She could have chosen to interpret Mary's actions generously and said, what is good in them? What is good in it, rather than what's bad? And that's a really critical piece of anything that we do. There's a classic book, a business book that was written, a while back. I forget exactly how many years, at least a decade. Classic enough that there's been a second edition to this book. It's a book many of you might resonate with the title. It's called Working with Difficult People. Okay. Somehow, lots of people were interested in this title. They see this title and they're really interested. It's called Working with Difficult People. But here's a quote from the book that I think is very subtle, obvious, and yet subtle at the same time. See, it says this. It says, instead of focusing on what's wrong with a person or relationship, recognize what is right. Seems obvious, right? Instead of focusing on what's wrong, recognize what's right. It seems obvious, and yet it is actually kind of hard to do. When you're in that moment, it's hard to do that. It's hard to sit there and say, I'm going to turn my mind around from what is wrong, and I'm going to look at what is right. And then the quote goes on and says, and focus energy on the many positives instead of harping on the negatives. Now, what's interesting about this is that the book is called Working with Difficult People. And so you buy the book on the presumption that the problem is them. I need this book. You know, you walk into the store, you have Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever, and you see this book. It says, Working with Difficult People. And you say, I need this book because I work with this person, and this person is difficult. So I need this book. And then you read the advice like this, and you kind of see that what it's doing is it's reversing the responsibility. Wait a second. No, maybe your attitude needs adjusting. Maybe the problem isn't so much that you're working with a difficult person, but the fact that you've chosen to see the person as difficult. Maybe the actual difficult person is you, because you're choosing to look at what the person is doing and see the negative. You're choosing to focus on the negative instead of the positive. You're choosing to focus on what's wrong instead of what's right. You're choosing to go into that situation and thinking about how you can change the other instead of asking, wait, would this situation be improved if I simply changed my attitude? If I simply changed my outlook? Maybe working with difficult people is about changing yourself so that they don't seem so difficult anymore. So recasting what the other person is doing in the most positive way as opposed to the negative is a really important part of seeing the value in what they're doing. Now, there's one last part of this passage. It's a very short passage. There's one last part of this passage where, again, the translation that we normally use, I think, fails us. And it's this. It's where Jesus says there is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. And that word better is problematic to me because it sets up a comparative. It sets up a comparative which isn't actually there in the text, okay? Again, I'll go back to the NRSV versus NKJV translation and then talk about that word that gets translated as better in the NRSV. I wish they had not chosen that word. Because if you look at it, while the NRSV says Mary has chosen the better part, and by the way, the other thing is the NRSV says there is need of only one thing. And the word only isn't there in the text either. The NKJV leaves the word only out because it's not there and just says there's need of one thing. But that doesn't mean it's only one thing. It's just you need this one thing. It's necessary, but there can be other things that are necessary. It's not only one thing. And Mary has chosen that good part. Didn't say better, just says good. Okay? See, Jesus isn't degrading serving. At no point does he tell Martha that she shouldn't be serving. The problem is her attitude in serving and not recognizing that the obligation she feels to serve isn't necessarily Mary's obligation. It isn't necessarily what Mary needs to be doing in that point in time. Martha's trying to impose her sense of obligation onto Mary. Right? And Jesus isn't saying that one is right and one is wrong. He's simply saying that what Mary is doing is good. Good for her. In fact, this word that gets translated there is not better, it's good. In fact, it's this Greek word agathos, from which, by the way, you get the name Agatha. Okay, all right. Means good or useful or beneficial. All right. And that idea of useful and beneficial as translations of this word agathos add the idea that the determination of it being good is situational. All right? I mean, something is useful in a situation. It's not necessarily generically useful, okay? For example, forks are useful unless you're eating soup. All right? So there's this difference between something that is objectively, good versus something that is situationally good. Things that are useful and beneficial are situationally good. They're not necessarily absolutely good in all circumstances. They're situationally good. And so this issue that what Mary has chosen is good, is useful, is beneficial, is that this is what she needs. That what she needs at this point in time in her life is to be sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to his teaching. This is what she needs. This is what is useful for her. This is what is beneficial for her. And Martha tried to pull her away from doing what she needed to do for her in order to be helped with doing what Martha felt Martha needed to do. And in the end, neither gets well served. Martha stops working, Jesus stops teaching. Martha's attitude is a wreck. No one's having fun because she's choosing to decide what Mary needs to be doing rather than letting Mary decide what Mary needs to be doing. And I wonder, what have you been pulled away from that's good for you? What have you been pulled away from? What have you allowed people around you or societal expectations or stereotypes or whatever it may be? What have you allowed to pull you away from what you know you ought to be doing? What you know is good for you? I mean, it can be all kinds of things. It can be exercise. It can be relaxation. It can be study. It can be personal development. It can be any of those kinds of things. But are you being pulled away and allowing people to pull you away from what you know you need to be doing? Are you being distracted from it? Because if that happens, when you get distracted from what you know is good for you, you will get filled with that worry and anxiety that is filling this situation. See, notice what Jesus says. Mary has chosen the good/better part. It's not a whole, it's not an absolute, it's a part. Right? Literally means a portion. It's a portion of a life, right? She's chosen a good portion of a life. There are choices to be made. What part is she going to choose? And she's chosen the part of life she needed to choose for herself in that time. And the question is, will you choose the good part? This isn't set up to be, you should always choose learning over serving. Jesus didn't say that. But rather, Mary was doing what Mary needed to do. And Martha was trying to impose that choice on her. So, what is good for you? What's useful for you? What's beneficial for you? What are the choices you need to make in your life to choose the good part, as opposed to the part that society wants you to choose, the external obligations that people place upon you? Have you figured out where you need to be? And if, in that situation, if Martha had figured out that for her, not because it was society's expectations, not because of how she had been raised, if she had decided that for her, she needed to be in the kitchen preparing food for her guests, she wouldn't have been complaining. She would have been happy to do it. And at no point does Jesus say that would have been an invalid choice for her, as long as it's the choice she was making for her. Mary knew the choice she needed to make for her, which was to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen. And so for her, in that situation, in that moment, it was the good part. Do you have an idea of what the good part is for you? And will you have the courage to shut out all the other voices and choose that good part for you? Amen.